Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for September 3rd, 2021. It's Friday, so I'm taking questions, and we have a lot of questions that are largely related to the aftermath of the U.S. evacuation from Afghanistan. What does it mean? Why did it happen? Who's responsible? Was Biden doing it for good or bad reasons, and so on? I'm sure many of you have these same kinds of questions. And just, for example, one, on the question of a policy shift, why would Biden break from the United Kingdom deep state policy of endless wars? Now, Tony Blair has an answer for that Biden was reacting to what he called the imbecilic slogan of ending the endless wars. Now, from Blair, this is an attack not just on Biden, but also on Trump, but also on the American people and the institution of the presidency as it is carried out in the United States. That is, that the president has the capacity to operate on the basis of what is in the interests of the population, as opposed to the private interests of very wealthy patrons or financial networks and so on. And what we've seen, unfortunately, for most of the last 50 years is American presidents acting more like parliamentary leaders, going along with the political parties in the Congress, going along with the funders and the financial benefactors, and carrying out policies that do not represent the interests of the United States. Now, when Blair says something like that, it reflects the panic and hysteria in British geopolitical circles, City of London circles, that the United States is no longer a reliable ally. Reliable ally for what? The people of the United Kingdom, the people of England, or no longer a reliable ally to carry out the interests of the British elite, the financial class, the City of London? That's the issue here. The U.S. has been a puppet on a British leash, using its military to impose imperial policy. The reason the British are hysterical is that what Biden just did was to break with that. So is this a full-scale break with British geopolitics? That's one of the questions that people are asking. Now, there's an article by one Robert Wilkie, who served in the Bush administration and in the Trump administration. He's from the Heritage Foundation now, and this appeared, actually I don't have the publication where it appeared, but what he did is he attacked Biden as being historically anti-British and anti-war. And he said that this is a danger for the establishment because we need the alliance with the British. Similarly, the New York Times London bureau chief ran a story yesterday saying Biden bucks foreign policy elite. What he says is interesting. He says that Biden, who was welcomed worldwide as a change from Trump, now appears on many levels to be carrying out the policies that Trump supported but was unable to implement. And he said, for example, unlike Trump, Biden stood up to the Washington foreign policy establishment. Trump was all for getting out of Afghanistan. In fact, he negotiated the agreement with the Taliban, which Biden implemented. But Trump never pulled the trigger. And while he's saying now it's because we didn't want to put the terrorists in the power without having conditions on them, that's exactly what he was doing. The conditions that we had on the agreement that was signed in February 2020 would have not been binding in any way on the Taliban, as Trump and his advisors knew. That's why Pompeo is so defensive about it. But what this New York Times article said is that the fact that Biden stood up to the foreign policy establishment has them very upset. Similarly, the Financial Times has an article saying that Biden is breaking with the COP26 conference, that is the global warming, man-made climate change international conference coming up in Glasgow, Scotland in 2 months. They're saying that Biden is not going along on carbon pricing, and he's not going along on fuel taxes. oil tax. Why? Because of his fear of what the American people will say. Well, the American people don't want to have to pay more taxes for the green policy. If you present to the American people, here's your choice. We can have a green policy that will allegedly stop the oceans from rising and the temperature from rising. And to do that, you have to pay more, you have to eat less, and so on. There's no consensus for that in the United States. And Biden is following in the footsteps of Trump on this. He's not denouncing the concept of man-made climate change, but this article in the Financial Times is a signal piece to the green movement. You'd better start heating up the environment around Biden. So we see these very interesting developments. Now, also there's a couple of articles that point out that the Biden administration, or Biden personally, in doing this with Afghanistan, stood up against NATO because the NATO members were saying we shouldn't pull out, we should stay there. These were people who greeted Biden warmly when he became the president. And now they're saying he's too much like Trump, he's ignoring them. And an example of this yesterday was the United Kingdom and France put forward a resolution before the UN which would establish safe corridors for humanitarian aid inside Afghanistan, which the Afghan government rejected as an attack on its sovereignty. Well, that's what it is. That's how they use these things. And the Biden administration opposed this resolution. And again, there was a freak out from Macron and the British that the U.S. is putting the idea of sovereignty ahead of allegedly safe humanitarian corridors, which without a military presence are not really safe unless you have an agreement with the Taliban. And if you're going to infringe on the sovereignty of Afghanistan, you're not going to get an agreement with the Taliban. So the issue here is not cozying up to the Taliban. The issue is realistically facing the fact that the world has changed. It changed in the last weeks as a result of what happened in Afghanistan. And either we figure out a way to live in peace with the Taliban, and in fact, work with their neighbors in countries like Russia and China to help develop the country, or else we're going to end up with a failed state which will become a center of terrorism, a center of drug production once again, and an enemy to the West. But why should we do things that we know will cause that, like financial warfare against Afghanistan? Here you have people who are saying, crying crocodile tears about the Afghan people not having freedoms and not having an ability to leave if they want, and yet at the same time supporting the cutoff of funds to them, which means that children are going to be starving in Afghanistan. 14 million people have food insecurity right now, and 4 million children face starvation, according to David Beasley of the World Food Program. So how is it that we're concerned with the future of Afghanistan if our leaders are supporting, through the Federal Reserve and the International Monetary Fund, a cutoff of funds to Afghanistan? So what we're seeing is a whole series of developments which raise the question of, is there a possibility for a change? Now, I should also point out, of course, that a real change would mean a true end to regime change wars, to geopolitical provocations, and so on. It does appear that that is not happening. Biden's meeting with Zelensky, we pledged more money to them. Biden and Zelensky talked about the great threat from Russia. We still have the push to establish a Pacific NATO, to confront China, to isolate and surround China. So we still have the war hawks calling the shots in U.S. policy. So it's incumbent on the American people to act to rein this in, to overturn it, to break with British geopolitics. We have an opportunity now, and that's the best opportunity we've had in quite a while. And finally, the last question was, why invest in Afghanistan? Why would anyone want to put money into that failed country? Well, for the reasons we've just discussed, that if you don't, you're going to kill people, You're going to create a situation where civil war is inevitable, where the inability of the government to function will mean terrorists will find sanctuary, and it means that the opium production will skyrocket again. That's the alternative. You can't win a war in a country like that. Why would you create a worsening situation which would mean you'll eventually have to go to war with them again? Why not work with the neighbors? Now, here's the point. After World War II, no one would argue that Germany was deserving of a helping hand after the atrocities committed under the Nazi regime, and also the Japanese, what they did. But look what happened. The revenge networks were overwhelmed, were defeated. Those who wanted revenge were pushed aside, and instead we had economic development plans, which meant that both Germany and Japan were able to become prosperous nations, prosperous democracies that were able to participate in a more peaceful world. Why can't you do that with Afghanistan? Well, that's the question that we have to pose. Now, I want to conclude with something that should give you some thought about the possibility that there are some people in the administration who might be open to the kinds of policies proposed by Helga Zepp and the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp LaRouche and the Schiller Institute. I just finished the book by William Burns, The Back Channel, a memoir of American diplomacy and the case for its renewal. Burns was a State Department official for over 30 years, going back to the Reagan administration. He's now the head of the CIA. And this book was written before he was brought in as CIA director by Biden. But there are some very interesting aspects to it, other than the fact that it's clear that he's very much influenced by people like James Baker and Colin Powell, who were secretaries of state that he served. He has a certain reverence for them, a certain sense that they were consummate professionals. Well, they put in place a lot of the policies that have led to the present conundrum regarding Afghanistan. But here's what he said, and just listen to these words and give it some thought. He said, America's unipolar moment was, by definition, temporary. Inevitably, our relative power would diminish as other players became wealthier, stronger, and more assertive. In the midst of these dramatic geopolitical shifts, some of which we accelerated with our own mistakes, we also lost our way in diplomacy. At first lulled by the experience of the post-Cold War dominance and then shocked by 9/11, we gradually devalued our economic tools. All too often, we over-relied on American hard power to achieve policy aims and ambitions, hastening the end of American dominance, deepening the desire and capacity of our adversaries to upend the American-led international order, and disillusioning the American public. Now then he went on to say that diplomacy now matters more than ever, because we're no longer the only big kid on the block. He goes on to say, quote, the window for defining a strategy for a changing international landscape and America's pivotal role is slowly closing, but it is by no means shut. That strategy will require a new compact on diplomacy, one that reinvests in diplomacy's core functions and roles, adapts smartly to new challenges and realities, and reinforces the connection between leadership abroad and rejuvenation at home. And here's the final quote from him. Quote, the militarization of diplomacy is a trap which leads to overuse or premature use of force and under-emphasis on non-military tools. In Iraq and Afghanistan, diplomats found themselves slipping into supporting roles in the military's counterinsurgency strategy, preoccupied with local social engineering and the kind of nation-building activities that were beyond the capacity of Americans to accomplish. It sometimes seemed as if we were trying to replicate the role of the 19th century British colonial service, not play the distinctive role of the American Foreign Service. End quote. I think that's a refreshing thought coming from someone who's a CIA director, given that the seat was previously held by people like John Brennan, who were open advocates of the unilateral American century and of the use of force to impose our rules-based order. How influential is Burns in this administration? Well, we really don't have the luxury of sitting back and watching. We, as Americans, have to mobilize for a full rejection of British geopolitical policy, of the neoliberal policy which that the U.S. military is imposing, has been imposing, and instead opening up the era of peaceful cooperation for mutual economic development. That's the challenge in the world today. That's what the true lesson of what happened in Afghanistan is. And it means we need a full accounting for who's responsible for these regime change wars, for the endless wars, who pushed them, and what is the alternative. And I would urge you to go to the schillerinstitute.com website, where you can look at the July 31st event and then the August 21st event, where we took up the question, both before and after the Taliban marched into Kabul, of what alternative policy should the United States adopt. So that's my update for today. Have a good weekend. I guess it's Labor Day in the United States, but I'll be back on Monday with an update.